After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the death, that is thanatology, various stages of death, the stages of suspended animation, the criteria for diagnosing brain death as well as brain stem death, and the Transplantation of Human Organs Act 1994. To introduce you the topic of thanatology, I will begin with a quote from Edward Munch, who said, quote, "From my rotting body flowers shall grow, and I am in them, and that is eternity." Basically, this thanatology word has arose from the Greek terms thanatos and logos. Thanatos means god of death, thanatos is the god of death, and the logos means knowledge. So it is basically the study of death or knowledge of death in its various aspects. Related discipline is the forensic taphonomy, which is the interdisciplinary study and interpretation of post-mortem processes of human remains in the dispositional context, that is the history of changes of a body following death. Let's see what are the stages of death. As we say that death is a process, it's not an event. The person dies in bits and pieces. All of a sudden the person never dies at a sudden moment. So there are certain stages of death, the somatic death as well as the molecular death. Somatic death is the complete and irreversible stoppage of the circulation, respiration and brain functions. That is, these three are tripod of life. This question of certifying death mainly comes in resuscitation timings and for organ transplantation. This knowledge is used. Only by withdrawal of artificial means it can be proved whether the person is alive or dead. A person who cannot survive after withdrawal of artificial maintenance are certified as dead. Thus, the success rate of transplantation mainly depends upon the organs involved and the rapidity of its removal after circulation has stopped. The cornea is the tissue which can be removed even up to 6 hours or even up to 12 or 24 hours of death. For the best results, of course, 6 hours is the period. The skin within 24 hours and the blood vessels within 72 hours for the sake of transplantation. The other organs like kidney, heart, lungs, pancreas and liver, they must be obtained as soon as possible as they tend to deteriorate very soon. According to modern concept, the somatic death coincides with the brainstem death and involves the complete and irreversible stoppage of vital stem functions. And this is what common man understands as death. Now, this brain death or the somatic death, this again can be of three types: the cortical death or cerebral death, the brainstem death, as well as the whole brain death. Now let's see one by one. What is the cortical or cerebral death? In cortical death, the brainstem is intact, and this produces a vegetative state in which there is respiration, but there is total loss of perception by the senses. And this state of deep coma can be caused by cerebral hypoxia, the toxic conditions or the widespread brain injury. Second is the brainstem death. In a brainstem death, the cerebrum may be intact, but it is cut off functionally by the stem lesion. So the loss of vital centers of the body that controls respiration and of the ascending reticular activating system that sustains consciousness, this caused the victim to be irreversibly comatose and incapable of spontaneous breathing. These symptoms can be produced by raised intracranial pressure, cerebral edema, as well as intracranial hemorrhages. Now, third is the whole brain death. In whole brain death, there is a permanent cessation of functions of all three, that is cerebrum, cerebellum, as well as brainstem. Now, second category after somatic death is the molecular death. So, molecular death is the death of all individual cells within the body. All biochemical activity within the cells comes to a stop. It comes 2 to 3 hours after somatic death. Molecular death usually occurs in a piecemeal manner, as the individual cells will continue to survive on their residual oxygen for a variable time even after the circulation has stopped, depending upon the metabolic activity of the cell. And that's why the cells of the kidney, they survive for a certain time, maybe around 1.5 hours or so, whereas the cells of the heart, they survive much less, and that's why this knowledge is used during the transplantation. The subsequently changes occur due to metabolic dysfunction and later from the structural disintegration. The nervous tissues, they die very rapidly. The brain dies within 5 minutes, but the muscles live up to 1 to 2 hours. Then let's understand the stage in between the death and the life, that is called as suspended animation. This suspended animation, or the stage of apparent death, this is the condition where signs of life are not found, as the functions are interrupted for some time or are reduced to a minimum level. The metabolic rate is so reduced that the requirement of the individual cell for oxygen is satisfied through the oxygen dissolved in the body fluids itself. However, resuscitation is successful in such cases and life continues. The person appears to be dead clinically, but he is not, since brainstem is working. By testing the brainstem reflexes, we can know whether the person is dead or not. Now let's see what are the various causes of suspended animation. One, in our Indian circumstances, that is voluntary induced by the yogis, the so-called yogis who practice yoga. They can voluntarily induce this stage of suspended animation. Then there are anesthesia, anesthetic drugs, they may induce the suspended animation. Barbiturates and opiates poisoning, the coma, concussion and deep shock, they may lead to suspended animation. The drowning, the electrocution, very important medico-legally. The frozen state and heat stroke also lead to sometimes suspended animation. The prolonged illness, the infections like cholera, typhoid, these are also lead to suspended animation. And the mesmeric trance, that may lead to suspended animation. And of course, in newborns, sometimes they are in this stage of suspended animation. Now, what is the medico-legal importance of this suspended animation is that the premature burial and cremation may happen in cases if they are not properly diagnosed. So that's how we see the cases, or we see in the news that the person has arose from the deathbed, arose from the cremation ground. So basically that person has been misdiagnosed as a case of death, certified as death, whereas he was in a stage of suspended animation. Now let's understand the various criteria for diagnosing brain death. Earliest criteria was developed in Philadelphia, and it was named as Philadelphia Protocol in 1969. Then it was refined Minnesota criteria in 1971, and then afterwards in 1994 by the Harvard criteria, which came into practice from 1994 and remained for quite some time. Let's understand what is that Harvard criteria, the basic criteria for certifying the brain death. The unreceptivity and unresponsiveness, that is the total unawareness to any external stimuli and any inner need, along with the complete unresponsiveness to even the most painful and intense stimuli. That is one criteria. Then no movements, absence of any spontaneous muscle movements in response to stimuli such as pain, touch, sound or light for a period of at least 1 hour. Then apnea, that is the absence of any spontaneous breathing for at least an hour, and in case when patient is on ventilator, the total absence of spontaneous breathing may be established by turning off the respirator for 3 minutes and observing whether there is any effort on the part of the subject to breathe spontaneously. Then fourth criteria is the absence of elicitable reflexes, that is as evidenced by the irreversible coma with abolition of central nervous system activity. In this, the pupil become fixed, dilated and do not respond to a direct source of bright light. The ocular movements and blinking are absent. There is no evidence of postural activity. The corneal and pharyngeal reflexes are also absent. The stretch tendon reflexes cannot be elicited. Then the isoelectric EEG, that is electroencephalogram. An isoelectric EEG has got confirmatory value. All these tests should be repeated after 24 hours. Further, it is also stressed that the patient should be declared dead before any effort is made to take him off the ventilator if he is then on a ventilator. And this declaration should not be delayed until he has been taken off the respirator and all artificially stimulated signs have ceased. So that was the Harvard criteria earlier. Then now see what are the criteria for diagnosing the brain stem death. The exclusion criteria for the diagnosis of brain death are, in this brain stem death, if the patient is under the influence of any drug, for example therapeutic drug or overdoses, so it will be excluded. Or next criteria is when the core body temperature falls below 35 degrees centigrade. Third criteria is where the patient is suffering from any severe metabolic or endocrine disorders which leads to coma, for example diabetes. Now the preconditions for diagnosing the brainstem death are: the patient must be in deep coma, the cause of the coma must be known, and the patient must be maintained on a ventilator. So these three criteria must be fulfilled. Now who should perform these tests? The brainstem deaths must be certified by two medical practitioners. The doctor involved should be experts in this field. Under no circumstances brainstem death diagnosis should be given by the transplant surgeon. One of the doctors should be the consultant in charge of the case, and each doctor should perform the test twice. Now what are the tests which are to be performed? Of course, the core body temperature has to be measured and it is to be ensured that it is above 35 degrees centigrade. The diagnosis of brainstem death is established by testing the functions of the cranial nerves as they pass through the brainstem. In case of irreversible brainstem death, the negative response will be recorded on the basis of the following findings, namely pupils fixed and dilated and non-responsive to changes in the intensity of the light, absence of the corneal reflex, absence of the vestibulo-ocular reflex, that is, there is no eye movement after installation of cold water in the ear. Then absent motor reflexes, which are tested by giving painful stimuli or other sensory stimuli and by looking for any grimace on the patient's face in response to that stimulus. Then absence of gag reflex to bronchial stimulation by inserting a suction catheter. Sixth criteria is that the no respiratory movements occur when the patient is disconnected from the ventilator for long enough to ensure the rise of carbon dioxide concentration in the blood above the threshold level for stimulating respiration after giving 100% oxygen for 5 minutes. So if there is absence of any spontaneous breathing within those 10 minutes, the brainstem then is incapable of reacting to the presence of carbon dioxide and thus is declared dead. When two doctors have performed these tests twice with negative results, the patient is pronounced to be brainstem dead and the death certificate is to be issued. Hypoxia, cardiac arrest, intracranial hemorrhages, poisoning and trauma to the brain, they may cause whole or part of the brain to be irreversibly damaged. So if the cortex alone is damaged, then the patient goes into deep coma. But the brainstem maintains the spontaneous respiration, and this stage is called persistent vegetative state or living cadaver, and death may occur months or even years after due to secondary infection or extension of the cerebral damage. These patients are in need of any life-sustaining treatment and are usually in need of nutrition and hydration only. So they are not in need of any life-sustaining treatment. If the brain stem is damaged due to trauma, cerebral edema, hemorrhage, hypoxia, infections like poliomyelitis, respiratory motor system involvement, or damage to the ascending reticular activating system causing permanent loss of consciousness, and higher centers in the cortex are also irreversibly damaged, then whole brain death occurs. Now let's understand what is the tissue and organ transplantation and how this knowledge of brain stem death and brain death, this can be utilized for the purpose of human mankind. The homologous donation. The homologous donation means grafting of the tissue from the one part of the body to another in the same patient. For example, bones or skin. So from some part of the same person, these parts are taken and transplanted to other part. That is called as homologous, from the same person. Second is the live donations. The live donations include blood and bone marrow transfusion and other live organs. Blood, as we know, is very frequently the body fluid which is transfused, donated. The cadaveric donations, as the name suggests, are donations of organs after death. But most organs should be obtained while the donor heart is still beating to improve the chances of success. Now let's understand what is the vegetative state. This is the state in which the patient still has a spontaneous breathing, stable circulation, and shows cycle of eye opening and closing, which may stimulate sleep and waking, but the patient is unaware of the self and the environment. The commonest causes are diffuse axonal injury and diffuse ischemic brain damage, widespread bilateral damage to the neocortex, diffuse damage to the white matter, and bilateral damage to the thalami. The beating heart donor. After the patient has undergone brainstem death, the retention of the patient on the ventilator facilitates fully oxygenated cadaver transplant, the so-called beating heart donor. But in India, this has got no legal sanction. The moment of death reflects the exact moment when the person dies. But again, this concept of moment of death has radically changed over the years. Very early in 17th century, who classified this as a mode of death. This happened before the era of heart transplantation, and this tripod of life was advanced by the French physician Marie Bichat, and it is known as Bichat's tripod of life. Bichat's tripod involved three basic modes of death: coma, syncope, and asphyxia. The coma, the causes related to the brain; the syncope from causes related to the heart; and asphyxia from causes related to the respiratory system. The tests were developed to determine the death of each organ, like test for circulation, test for respiration, and test for neurological, you can say, the brain function. Let's see, just for the theoretical point of view, from historical perspective, let's see what were those. The Magnus test, it was introduced way back in 1872. The test consisted of a tying of a string around one of the fingers of the supposedly dead person. The pressure applied had to be just above that in veins, but just below that in arteries. This will occlude the veins but not the arteries. If the circulation was still maintained, the finger distal to the ligature would swell. This is a completely outdated test now. The I-cord test, again it has been outdated. The diaphanous test, the fingernail test, and the other nail test, and heat test, of course, because that are inhuman. Then there were tests for respiration like Winslow's test, the mirror test, the feather test. Then the test for the brain functions like the sensibility of the body. Then there are miscellaneous tests like Ripoll sign. The external pressure over the eyes causes distortion of the roundness of papillary apertures, and with the help of X-ray fluoroscopy. All these tests are now outdated now, so we don't use it for that. We follow the criteria of brain death, brain stem death wherever required. Now let's see the Transplantation of Human Organs Act 1994. The Act mainly reflects upon three aspects. One is it aims at putting a stop to any live unrelated transplant. Second is, in case of a live related transplant, it defines that the donor and the recipient are genetically related. Only exception is that if the transplant is being performed with prior approval from the authorization committee on an application jointly made by the donor and recipient, and it accepts the brainstem death criteria, where the certification of death should be done by a panel of experts consisting of a medical officer in charge of the hospital, an independent medical specialist, a neurologist or neurosurgeon, and the doctor treating the patient, which is essential. So this committee will certify the death. And the Act has defined human organ as any part of the human body consisting of a structured arrangement of tissues which, if wholly removed, cannot be replicated by the body. Bone marrow transplant is outside the purview of this Act. The organs which can be removed after death are kidney, heart, liver, lungs, pancreas, eyes, basically cornea, the eardrums and ear bones. The organs can be removed from the dead body of a donor at any place. Removal of the organs from the donors may be done on his authorization or that of the person who is the legal guardian of the person. In case of unclaimed bodies in hospital or prison, organs can be removed after 48 hours. The organs removed should be preserved according to the current and accepted scientific methods to ensure viability of the organ. The human organs cannot be removed for any purpose other than the therapeutic purpose. The doctor should not remove the organs unless he had explained all possible effects, complications and hazards connected with the removal and transplantation to the donor and recipient both respectively. This TOHA, the Transplantation of Human Organ Act, imposes for compulsory registration of hospitals engaged in the removal, storage or transplantation of human organs, and the central and state governments are empowered to appoint appropriate authority which can grant registration of such hospitals, renew their licenses, suspend or cancel the registration and to specify conditions for the same. The government is also empowered to appoint authorization committee or committee with nominated members for the purpose of imposing restrictions on the removal and transplantation of human organs. And besides provision for appeal, the Act also provides punishment for unauthorized removal of human organs or for commercial dealings thereof, or for contravention of any other provisions for the Act. And such punishments range from removal of the names of the erring medical practitioner from the register of the State Medical Council for 2 years for the first offence and permanently for the subsequent offence, or imprisonment up to 5 years and fine up to Rs 10,000 based on the nature and the degree of the offence. Under this Act, an offence is cognizable only when the complaint is made by appropriate authority about the alleged offence and his intention to make a complaint to the court in that case. The Act also punishes whosoever engages in commercial dealings in human organs with imprisonment for a term varying from Rs 10 to 20,000. To summarize the topic of thanatology, death. Death is a process, not an event. Somatic and molecular deaths are different. Suspended animation is the stage of apparent death, and this knowledge can be utilized for the benefit of mankind in organ donation. The Philadelphia, Minnesota, Harvard criteria of certification of brain death were used earlier, which have now been replaced with the brainstem death. And this brainstem death should be certified by a team of doctors after examination with a gap of 6 hours. Transplantation of Human Organs Act was formed in 1994 and implemented with effect from 1995. Several amendments have been made over the time with directions from Supreme Court, and it's an ongoing process.